For a world which is full of conflicts, disagreements, and frequent disruptions, dialogue and discourse is the usual way out. Now, one such dialogue that took place from 13th to 15th of June 2024 was the G7 summit, the 50th G7 summit of 2024. Now, in this summit, key world leaders from prominent industrialized countries met and discussed on global issues. Now, this becomes even more important at this particular juncture for the whole world and for India as well. From global perspective, this meeting or this summit took place at the backdrop of intense global conflicts. These global conflicts include several conflicts in the Middle East, which includes your Israel-Hamas issue, Israel-Palestine issue, alongside the Israel-Iran issue as well, and also Russia-Ukraine war, which is currently on. Also, several trade wars which are going on currently in the world, especially of US and China, European Union and China. So because of these things, this G7 summit becomes critically important for the entire world and for the globe. Now, from an Indian perspective, we saw that in the start of the June month, for 4 consecutive days, there were 4 terror incidents or terror attacks which happened in the Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir. And our Prime Minister Narendra Modi also visited this G7 summit at this backdrop, and it was the first visit of our Prime Minister after the formation of a new government and after the Lok Sabha elections 2024. So from Indian perspective also, this G7 summit 2024 and overall G7 as an intergovernmental agency becomes very, very important. So in this particular session, we'll be trying to understand the G7 as an organization, G7 Summit 2024, several key takeaways from G7 Summit, what are the criticisms, what are the issues surrounding this G7, and what will be an ideal way forward, alongside the importance of G7 geopolitically and strategically for India. All these things we'll be trying to understand in this session. Hello, my name is Preetpal Singh, and today's topic is G7 Summit 2024.
Well, we are serving it with a side of diplomacy. As G7 leaders gather in southern Italy, Vantage is taking you to the heart of the action. What's the agenda? Who's invited? And how is Italy preparing for it?
World leaders have arrived in southern Italy ahead of the 50th G7 Leaders Summit. The meeting brings together leaders of the world's 7 largest advanced economies to tackle some of the biggest issues.
Now, firstly, we'll be trying to understand G7 as a grouping. Now, G7, as the name suggests, it is the grouping of 7 prominent industrialized countries in the world. Now, it started at the backdrop of 1973 oil crisis, which eventually led to the financial crisis. At that backdrop, the finance ministers of 6 prominent nations, they met. And that was informally known as the Library Group. And formally, all these things started in the year 1975, when the leaders of 6 prominent countries, which includes France, Germany, US, UK, Japan, and Italy, they met on 15th of November 1975. And this is where the G7 foundation was laid. Initially, it was G6, but eventually in 1976, Canada also got added to the grouping, and eventually it came to be known as G7. Now, European Union is also a non-enumerated member of this G7. Now, for a brief period of time in history, G7 also transformed into the grouping of 8, that is G8, in 1997. Why? Because in 1997, Russia got added to this G7 grouping, and it became G8. But in 2014, Russia was removed from this G8 grouping, which now again became G7. And why was Russia removed? Because Russia annexed Crimea during that period of time. Because of that, Russia got removed from G8, and after 2014, it again came to be known as G7 grouping. And that was the brief history of G7. Now, G7 as a grouping meets annually, and they discuss very important key issues in relation to the global economic security, global energy security, and they discuss very critical issues related to global economic governance, international security, energy policy, and several other political and economic issues of the importance for the entire world and entire globe. Now, one thing for us to notice here is that G7 is not having any formal backing. It is not having any formal charter, nor it is having any secretariat. Now, G7 is also not having any legal or institutional basis. But still, it is a very, very prominent organization because it is the grouping of the most prosperous and industrialized nations in the whole world. Now, over the years, G7 has emerged as a very important platform for the discussion of global issues in relation to the political, geopolitical, and economic landscape of the entire world, which is why G7 can't be negated or can't be ignored by the whole world. Now, you must have heard of 3 key groupings. One is G20, one is G8, and one is G7. Now, G7 is the most premium grouping. G20 is a larger grouping. And if you remember, the G20 summit last year in 2023 happened in New Delhi, India, where India was the president of G20 for the year 2023. Now, G20 is a broader grouping which includes 20 prominent nations. India is also part of it. Then there is G8, where Russia was also part, but Russia was removed after 2014. And after that, it is left with the G7, the most prominent 7 nations. Now, G7 nations account for just 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world GDP, and 60% of the global net wealth, which makes the G7 even more important economically. Now, since we have understood about the G7 as a grouping, let us understand the G7 summit of 2024. Now, this summit was the 50th summit of G7 grouping. Now, this summit took place in the Borgo Ignazia resort in the Fasano city of Apulia region in Italy. And the main key agenda of the summit included 5 to 6 key prominent issues. First was the Middle East conflict and Russia-Ukraine conflict, which was very high on the agenda of this G7 summit. Also, another key point was about African region. The third prominent key issue which was discussed was in relation to defending rule-based international order. The fourth prominent point which was discussed was the coordination of economic policies of the entire world. Also, the issue of climate change, global warming, and rising temperature was also addressed here. And global health initiatives were also part of discussion in this G7 summit. Now, if you have to understand about the details and proceedings of the G7 summit, it can be divided into 6 broader issues. First issue was related to the regional security. Second was related to economic security. Third was related to migration. Fourth was related to climate change. Fifth was related to artificial intelligence. And sixth was related to health and food security. Now, if we come to regional security, all the G7 nations promised $50 billion loan to Ukraine. Now, the money will be coming from the proceeds of the interests which will be generated from the frozen Russian assets. And prominently, these assets have been frozen in European Union. So, interest proceeds from those frozen assets will be used to give loan to Ukraine, which is worth $50 billion. Now, this will be used for military, economic, and humanitarian aspect in Ukraine. Also, Ukraine signed a security pact with the United States and Japan as well. Also, one more thing which was reiterated in relation to regional security was immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and also boosting up the humanitarian aid in that particular region. Also upholding the security interests and peace in Israel as well. That is in relation to the regional security. Now, this G7 summit talked about the challenges and opportunities in this migration aspect, especially the people who are migrating from countries because of conflicts or from countries because of rampant poverty. That is one issue. Another issue was the focus on the root cause of irregular migration happening in the entire world. Also, several efforts to enhance the border management and also to tackle the issue of organized crime and smuggling in order to reduce this menace of irregular migration in the world. Now, third key important point of discussion was AI, that is artificial intelligence. Now, AI grabbed all the headlines because of Pope Francis warning the world leaders that humans must not lose the control of technology, that is artificial intelligence. He also said that AI represented an epochal transformation in the whole mankind, and also he stressed upon more closer oversight of artificial intelligence so that human life and dignity can also be preserved and security can also be maintained. Now, adverse outcomes of AI technologies are also on the list of long-term risks facing the entire world. And what is the need of the hour, according to the G7 summit, is coordination, risk management, and advanced international standards in order to ensure that AI is safe, secure, and efficient for utilization of humankind and mankind. Now, fourth key issue which was discussed was in relation to economic security. Now, from economic perspective, it was reiterated that the whole world should be a level playing field when it comes to international trade. Also, we need to introduce resilient supply chains and also close any lacunas which exist in the supply chains in the entire world, and also to form substitutes of different supply chains, and also to protect critical and sensitive technologies in the entire world, which can also ensure that economic security and international security and peace is preserved in the world. Now, the fifth key issue was in relation to the climate change, where all the 7 nations reiterated their commitment towards tackling the menace of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. Also, they reiterated that they'll be meeting their commitments which were made at COP28. Also, the talk centered around international collaboration on nuclear and fusion energy even further, so as to ensure a sustainable, clean future for the entire world. Last but not the least was in relation to health and food security. Now, in relation to that, Apulia Food Security Initiative was launched. Also, these countries, they talked about transforming the global health security financing and also to tackle and address the antimicrobial resistance issue in the entire world. So around health and food security also, these were the key issues which were discussed. And overall, if we see under these 6 different heads, one very prominent thing which we get to know is that G7 summit reiterated closer cooperation, closer coordination on key global issues and key global conflicts of the 7 prominent countries, which is again a very positive step in regards to a rule-based international international order, which can cooperate, coordinate, and tackle various issues with collaboration. Now let us come to India and the G7 summit. So our Honorable Prime Minister visited the G7 summit for the outreach session on artificial intelligence. And in our Prime Minister's speech, several key issues were highlighted, which are very prominent for us to know. Now, our Prime Minister talked about ending the monopoly in technology by few nations or by few developed nations. He said that the monopoly on technology by few companies and by few countries should end, and there should be more decentralization. Also, he talked about the priorities and concerns of Global South, which India has been reiterating time and again. Also, he talked about India's leadership in artificial intelligence and how India has been doing pioneering work in relation to artificial intelligence field.
For generations, Indian farms have been sown and tilled only with traditional know-how. But some like Nitin Patil are trying out something different. With sensor devices on his vineyard that check weather and soil health and uses artificial intelligence to figure out when to water the crops, add fertilizer and tackle pests.
And how India is committed towards artificial intelligence for all, that is AI for all, and the division between haves and have-nots have been erased. Also, he talked about the synergy between the G7 summit, which is currently happening, and the G20 summit, which happened in 2023, where India was the president. Now, in both the groupings, we see a bit of synergy, where both the groupings are addressing key international issues. Now, India also reiterated that it is fully committed to its net zero target by 2070, and also the commitment towards becoming a developed country by the year 2047. All these key issues were highlighted by our Prime Minister in the G7 summit of 2024. Now, from a broader perspective, let us try to understand that how this G7 grouping overall geopolitically is very significant and important for India. India is the 5th largest economy in the whole world, and it is the largest democracy in the whole world. Now, in relation to these things, now G7 as a grouping also have a very important role to play in the geostrategic positioning of India. That is why its cooperation is key for both, that is G7 and India as well. Also, this is a platform for India for interaction with the collective West, that is the Western industrialized countries, and also to reiterate its strategic policy of a multi-alignment and autonomy, which India has been reiterating multiple times. Now, this grouping's cooperation with India can also transform India's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, Indo-Pacific as a region is of very much importance to US also and to European Union as well, which is why India's cooperation with G7 is very necessary if we talk about Indo-Pacific security. Now, in relation to technological transfer and cooperation as well, India and G7 go a long way. And also to enhance the bilateral engagements between the countries, as we saw in the case of India and Canada relation, where the Prime Minister of Canada and the PM of India, they basically met on the sidelines of the G7 summit. Also, since India has to become a world power, a major global player,
the Indian economy is booming. This year, the country's GDP is expected to grow between 6 and 7%.
India is the world's fastest growing major economy.
We see India growing from about $3.5 trillion in 2023 to about $7 trillion by the end of the decade.
Although the US and China still dwarf the nation in terms of total gross domestic product, powered by a population of 1.4 billion, India could become the leader in global economic growth.
And a Vishwa Guru, it is very important for India to participate in the regional security and the global security, and where G7 plays a very critical role, is also to counter the rise of China, because China's expansionist activities and assertive attitude has been increasing lately in the last few years. And to counter that, India's cooperation with the G7 and Indo-Pacific security, this becomes critically important to counter the rise of China in the region and in the world. Also, definitely, G7 serves as a platform for India to voice the concerns of the Southeast Asia and also on a broader level. So from that perspective as well, G7 as an organization becomes very, very important for India. Now let us understand some key criticisms and issues related to G7 as a grouping. Now, first prominent issue and criticism for G7 is its limited representation. Now, it has been criticized a lot because of its pro-elitist attitude, pro-capitalist attitude, Western-centric approach, and also an overt Western bias. Because of these things, it has been criticized lately. And also, second prominent issue with G7 is that many people say it is ineffective and outdated because key important players in the entire world, that is China, India, Brazil, South Africa, they are not a part of this G7, which makes this G7 non-inclusive and which makes it not relevant and not reflecting the geopolitical reality of the current world, which is why it has been criticized from several quarters, and several protests also over the years have happened against this G7 grouping in several of the countries. Also, reforms, changes, and overhaul are required in a lot of global multilateral institutions and groupings, and G7 is a part of it. Now, several measures should definitely be taken to make these organizations and groupings more effective, more inclusive, and more efficient. And also, they should be able to reflect the modern day geopolitical realities and not the outdated geopolitical realities which existed but several decades ago. Now, as India rises in the global stage, its cooperation with G7 will play a pivotal role in ensuring a balanced and inclusive world order. Also, we hope that such summits like G7 and G20 leads the world towards a rightful and a good path, whereby all the global issues are resolved amicably and peace and security of the entire world and India as a region is also ensured. I hope you gained a new perspective from this session. All the very best and have a great day.